Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my 2023 Summer Split LCS Primer and Power Rankings video. Incredibly excited to get into this one. Obviously, you guys know the Primer Power Ranking stuff at the beginning of every split are probably my favorite videos to make across the entire year, and you guys seem to enjoy them just as much. It's my favorite series that we do here on the channel, the best bit of analysis that I can give you. Obviously, some external circumstances surrounding the LCS in this one, and we'll touch on that in just a second. But first and foremost, if you are excited for this content, let me know down in the comments section below. Of course, we put a lot of time and effort into these videos every year. These are the videos that are the longest. They usually are the most prep work because I'm watching film not only from the previous split, but from a lot of different regions, especially in a place like the LCS that is importing a lot. And so we put a lot of time and effort into making sure these videos are as accurate and as well produced as possible. So I would really appreciate it if you guys let me know if you are enjoying it down in the comment section below. And I usually don't ask this at the beginning of content, but if you want to leave a like, I really would appreciate it. Of course, if you want to wait until you see if you actually like the video, that is fine too. But of course, I gotta talk about the elephant in the room first and foremost with this LCS video, and that is the walkout. And you know, I want to make this short, I want to make this quick, but you know, I am going to say my thoughts here. First of all, I have to say, I stand with the players. There is no ambiguity in a situation like this. I am all for the players walking out. I'm incredibly proud of these players for deciding to take their future into their own hands. They were not being given a seat at the table when it came to Riot, and so the Players Association decided it was in their best interest to force Riot's hand, and that's exactly what they're doing. I know that that's affecting the start of the split. As of now, it's delayed by 2 weeks, and you know that could potentially turn into more, but I'm still proud of these players, and the ball really is in Riot's court at this point. If you want more resources for what exactly is going on, why I'm choosing to stand with the players and all that, and, you know, maybe some, you know, details as to why all of this is happening in the first place, you can go check out my Twitter. The link to that's going to be down in the description below. Not only have I tweeted a lot about this, but I've retweeted a lot of really good accounts that are talking about this in a very productive way. And so if you want more details on that, check out the link below on Twitter. But I do want to make it known that I stand with the players, and if for some reason or another there does end up being scab games when it comes to the LCS, I will not be covering them on this channel. I have no desire to cover any games that go against the wishes of the PA, and so I'm going to be, you know, previewing and power ranking these teams as if the season is going to happen as normal, but again, you know, there are a lot of external circumstances right now that might lead to that not being the case. But with that little aside out of the way, it's time to get into the actual video. I don't want to bog down a lot of the analysis with the extracurriculars that are happening outside of the game. For the rest of this video, I'm just going to be talking about the teams and the players and talking about where I think that they're going to land if we do indeed have a summer split. Of course, another prereq that I do at the beginning of all these videos, these are all just my opinions. This is the opinion warning part of the video. I'm going to be power ranking all the teams, and I'm also going to be power ranking all of the players within their respective roles from 1 to 10, and again, we are going to disagree. It's just going to happen. We're not going to agree on everything, whether that be the team power rankings or the player power rankings, and that's totally okay. I always, you know, say at the beginning of these videos, there's a little bit of a buffer. I'm going to be putting the teams in tiers, and I would say for the players as well, there's usually a 2 or 3 slot, like, up or down trajectory. If you're at number 7, I could see you being as bad as, like, 9 or 10 in the league, realistically, or as good as, like, a top 3, top 4 player in your role. All of those are realistic outcomes for a player that might be in that spot. So if you look at the list and you see a player at 7 and you're like, oh, that's absurd, they should be at 5, you know, that's great. We can have a civil conversation about that down in the comment section below, but let me know who you think they should be above that is above them. That's always an important criteria, but with that out of the way, it's time to jump into it. If you're new here, what we do is go team by team from number 10 in my power rankings to number 1. They're going to be tiered as well from A tier down to D tier, and we're going to be talking about the strengths and weaknesses, how I think the playstyle might function, and whether I think the org is moving in the right direction. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. I know it was a little bit of a 4-minute preamble on this video, which is usually not how I like to do things, but a lot of things to address, I would say, at the beginning with the LCS. So it's time to jump into the power rankings. And if we're starting from 10th place, if we're starting last, that means that we are going to be starting with the team that I believe is the worst in the LCS as of right now. And for me, the team that comes in at the bottom of D tier and at number 10 in my power rankings, it is going to be Immortals. They come in at number 10 for me. They are the worst team in the league, in my opinion. I think that they took a roster that already was a little bit up and down, and they honestly removed a couple of the win conditions, or really one of the win conditions in my mind, for a player that I think is good, but not great. And they also, just the changes that they made, I don't think were super extravagant. What you're seeing on the screen, of course, the power ranking and the tier, you're going to see the standings of where they finished in spring, what place they finished, what record they had, kind of give you some context as to where they're heading into in summer, and then, all the players on screen with their ranking in their position below that. So you'll see like 10 below Solo, 10 below Kenvi. I rank them 10 out of 10 in their position, Balulu 8 out of 10, etc., etc. In parentheses, you'll see whether that's rising or falling from where they were in spring, and that's going to be associated with each player. So Solo ends up going down because I'm taking into account his ranking that I gave him at the beginning of the year on TSM. But Balulu, Treats, these players weren't in the LCS at the beginning of the year, so they are new rankings. I hope that explains what the graphics on the screen are, but this is Immortals. They're just not really all that inspiring. They didn't make a ton of changes, and the ones that they did make, I don't necessarily think are massive upgrades to the team by any margin. I still think that this team is going to struggle to win games, and I'm expecting bounce back splits from a lot of the other teams that are a little bit lower in the standings. And so for me, Immortals comes in at a pretty clear 10th place and at the bottom of D tier, but let's go ahead and talk about why there is at least some upside with this roster. Their roster is looking like Solo in the top lane, Kenvi in the jungle, Balulu in the mid lane, Tactical at AD carry, and Treats at support. Couple of changes here. Solo coming into the top lane to replace Revenge, who ends up going on to Evil Geniuses. We'll talk about him a bit later, and Treats coming in to play support. I think both of these moves are interesting. We'll go ahead and go through each player individually, kind of talking about who they are, whether I think they've got some upward trajectory. Solo in the top lane, it's an unfortunate change that I think had to be made. Immortals, I think, making the decision to move on from Revenge. I'm not sure if it's because they received, like, big money in order to, get him off the team. Evil Genius is clearly, showing that they wanted to rebuild and go in a different direction, and Revenge was clearly a big part of those plans, but I'm not sure if Immortals didn't want to keep him in the first place. Either way, I think you are downgrading here in the top lane, and that's not to say that I hate Solo as a player. I certainly don't. This 10th place ranking is a little bit unfortunate. I think of all the positions in the LCS, I ironically think that top lane is probably the deepest at the current moment, and so Solo coming in at number 10 in that position isn't as bad as I think you could think it would be. He's just not going to break the bank, especially on a team that doesn't have a ton of, like, hyper carries around him. I mean, a couple of players that are incredibly talented, which we'll get to, but none that have really consistently been able to be unlocked, I would guess, in the LCS. And so Solo's fine. He's a weak side top laner, someone who's really good on tanks. He's actually a really good team fighter, someone who I think gets really underrated in that facet of the game in particular. And I think generally speaking, a lot of teams would like to have a player like Solo. My only concern with him on this team in particular is that he's not really this big, like, hyper carry. And that's kind of who he's replacing here in Revenge. Someone who wanted resources that you could play towards in the top lane. Someone who, if you did leave on an island isolated 1v1, actually had a pretty decent chance of being able to generate his own lead. Solo's just not that kind of player. He's not going to be going up against the best top laners in the league and consistently being up, 10, 20 CS in laning phase, just, on these carry versus carry matchups. It's not really who he is. He's still a solid player, and again, like I said, still an LCS caliber, starting top laner. I don't hate him in isolation. I'm just not sure he's going to be a super big asset for this team, and so he comes in at last place in terms of my top lane rankings. And then you've got Kenvi in the jungle, someone who I don't want to give up on him. I really don't want to give up on the idea of what Kenvi can become, but man, he has been wasted on this organization in Immortals. Cast your minds back 2 years, he was the biggest prospect in the NAC, or at the time, in NA Academy for the 100 Thieves system. Everybody was talking about, him getting promoted up to 100 Thieves and immediately becoming one of the league's best junglers. That's where we were at with Kenvi just a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, he doesn't end up getting the job on 100 Thieves. He has to leave the organization, go to Immortals, and he just has not been it at the LCS level. Ironically enough, I do think he probably had his best LCS split in spring. It's not saying a whole ton because I don't think he's really been all that proactive and all that good up until this point in the LCS, but I do think he showed a lot of, growth and development with better talent around him, especially as the talent situation improved with Balulu coming into the mid lane about midway through the year. I think that helped Kenvi out a lot, and I still think he can be a solid player. He's gonna have to come in at number 10 in my jungle rankings, but that's not to say he doesn't have upside. I can really see a situation where, you get talent around him and he really can start to unlock and be, I don't want to say like a contracts level player, but someone who can be kind of like that for a relatively decent team in the league. Unfortunately, it just hasn't happened up until this point in the LCS, and because we haven't seen it at this level, and honestly, he's been given quite a few opportunities, at least to play, maybe not with great talent, but at least to play, I'm going to have to rank him pretty low just until he proves that that is something that he can actually do. But I'm not, completely eliminating the idea that Kenvi figures it out, and him and Balulu especially develop a really nice chemistry here in the jungle mid lane. But let's talk about Balulu, because he's easily the best player on this team. He got promoted from Immortals Challengers about midway through last split. He was brought in as cover. You brought in both him and Fleshy from Turkey, and I think Balulu honestly clearly proved to be the most impactful member of Immortals. As soon as he joined that roster, all of a sudden things started to lighten up for this team. They had a win condition that they could actively play through. He's got his kind of eclectic champion pool. He loves his Zoe. He'll play these more aggressive, control mage style, like burst mage type of mid laners, and I think that definitely works for this team. And again, like I said, I think if him and Kenvi can develop a really nice chemistry here for the rest of the year, there is upside in terms of that duo. I'm just kind of worried about the rest of this team being able to adapt to that. But Balulu in isolation as a player, I actually think is pretty good, and he's definitely going to be the driving force, I think, for a lot of what Immortals wants to do over the course of this year. They're lucky to have him. But then you get to the bot lane, Tactical and Treats. It was Tactical and Fleshy last split. Fleshy gets replaced by Treats here. I think that's a minor upgrade. The last time we saw Treats, he was fine. He was a pretty good support in the LEC. I think he's going to be a pretty good support here in the LCS, but the problem is that Tactical is Tactical. You know exactly what you're going to get with him, and that is the most risky AD carry in the LCS. He is going to die over and over again trying to make plays, and if you've got players around him that can enable him, that can push him forward, that can kind of back up some of his more aggressive plays, you're going to be in a pretty good position. Go back to what he was on Team Liquid, but what we've noticed is that if you don't have that talent around you that's going to be able to kind of cultivate his early game, keep him safe, and get him to the point in the game where he can try to 1v5, if you don't have that opportunity, if you don't have those players, he's not going to look very good. He's been the worst AD carry in the league, basically, for the last 2 years, and that's just not a very good look. He comes in at number 10 in terms of my bot lane rankings. I'm not going to say I'm fully giving up on Tactical, because I think the talent is still there, but I think what we're learning about him is that he needs to be on a top team in order to look like a good AD carry, and I just don't think that's what this Immortals team is going to be. And then you've got Treats, like I said, in the support position. He's fine. He's not a needle mover, in my opinion. I think a lot of people are going to look at him as a needle mover. I'm actually a Treats fan. Go back on this channel a couple of years. I've been pretty high on him and his ability to, improve the macro of the teams that he's been going to. Go back to the TSM times. Even, SK Gaming, when that team was kind of up and down, he was pretty good on that team, whether it was in the jungle or in the support role. I think what you're really hoping for in a perfect scenario is him being able to rein in Tactical, be able to make that bot lane a little bit more consistent, because again, if you can get the talent out of Tactical and, kind of limit the mistakes, he's a really good bot laner. He can take over games. We even saw it in spring. There were 1 or 2 games where Tactical absolutely went off. The problem is that in the other 10 or 11 games, he just got absolutely blasted. And so if you can maybe rein Tactical in, if you're bringing Treats in to be a veteran presence that's going to be able to play with bot lane a little bit better, and if this team wants to play around that, I could see a world in which it could end up working out, but I'm really just not betting on that. I just imagine this team is going to get outskilled. I think Balulu is a solid player, and I do think Kenvi and Treats have upside in terms of what they would be able to do on different teams, but I think the collection of players on Immortals here just isn't all that complimentary, and for me, they're going to come in last place in my power rankings because of it. Now moving on to number 9 in my power rankings, and this is going to be the top of D tier for me. I didn't really explain what D tier was, but, we've got A, B, C, and D tier in these power rankings. D tier to me are the worst teams in the league. These are teams that I wouldn't expect to be competing for a top 6 spot, but because playoffs is top 8, anybody really has a chance. Theoretically, these teams could have a good split, but these are the 2 teams that I'm expecting to not be the playoff teams. To me, they are the 2 worst teams in the league, the teams with the least amount of upside, the teams that I don't really see a lot of potential in, for good or for bad. And for me, coming in at the top of D tier and coming in at number 9 in my power rankings, it is going to be TSM. It's not going to be a team that maybe you expected. This team was actually relatively competitive for a lot of spring split. There were moments where they actually looked okay, and honestly, they were in the playoff race for pretty much the entirety of the split for top 6. They end up finishing 7th, and I'm a little bit more concerned about this team now moving into summer because I just don't think that they are better. I think that they made a couple of changes, a couple of them good, a couple of them, one of them being bad, and I think it's going to matter a lot, but we'll go ahead and get into that when we get into the roster review, which I guess should be now, huh? So let's go ahead and talk about what the roster is looking like. In the top lane, it's Haunter. In the jungle, it's Boogie. In the mid lane, it's Ruby, or at least it's going to be Ruby eventually. We'll talk about that when we get there. In the bot lane, it's going to be Wild Turtle, and at support, it's going to be Chime. certainly an intriguing lineup, I think, on paper. A couple of these guys ended up finishing out the season. Really, the only change from, technically, the last week of the season is the mid lane position here, but I actually think it's going to be a pretty big change, and I'll talk about that when we get there. But, of course, we go top to support on this channel, so let's go ahead and talk about Haunter first and foremost. Him coming in, he played basically only the last week of the season, but he was really good in the NACL throughout all of last split. I actually thought he was one of the more consistent top laners in the entirety of the NACL, and his laning in general was just really, really good. His team fighting's always been really, really good. He's just been underrated for quite a long time. He's been a really quality player at the LCS level basically every time that he's been given the opportunity, and last time, you know, he got 1 week of action, but he was pretty good in it. It was certainly no exception, and so I do like the addition here. I think he's better than Solo in the top lane, or at least he's going to give you more options than Solo, because I think he's just as stable as a weak side top laner if you need him to be that, but I think he's a little bit more explosive as a carry if you need him to be that, and so I like the addition of Haunter. I think in general, this is going to be a good ad for them. And then you've got Boogie returning here in the jungle. Up and down split, I would say mostly downs from Boogie, and that's not necessarily super surprising. He's a pretty big feaster famine player, and, you know, there are going to be times where he's just a little bit invisible, especially when the rest of his team is not pushing forward, but this team didn't really play around jungle at all over the course of Spring Split. In fact, they kind of just left him to the wolves. They said, go path. If the enemy team invests a lot into getting you behind, sorry, we're not really going to do a whole ton about that. And honestly, I don't really expect that to change. It's weird, he went up in terms of my jungle rankings because a couple of players just had to go down, and I think the jungle in general just kind of changed a little bit in terms of the bottom of the standings, but he's still not someone that I would be super confident in as a starting jungler in the league. He's not awful. He certainly is a low-end starting caliber jungler, at least in my opinion, but certainly not someone that's going to move the needle, in my opinion, from making this a team that, you know, had some decent performances to, you know, a team that is bringing in talent and being able to upgrade on that front. I think he's just going to be along for the ride. If you've got good players around him, I think you can win with him, but I don't think he's someone that I'm super confident is going to drag your team across the finish line if nobody else is playing well. I think he's going to be a product of what the rest of the roster ends up being, and that's fine. It's just not anything fantastic here in the LCS. And then we get to the mid lane position. I'm going to talk about Ruby mostly here, but it looks like he's not going to be able to make the start of the split, obviously. Maybe with the start time pushed back, things are going to change a little bit, but TSM has officially signed Insanity into the mid lane. That's a great pickup, a great addition. Insanity is a really, really good player. He's better than Ruby in basically every conceivable aspect, and I think if they did go with Insanity for the whole split, this team would not be 9th. I think that they would be significantly higher than that, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It looks like he's going to be a temporary addition to the team, and that's fine. Again, you know, I think he's the better player. He showed a lot of good things on Dignitas Challengers, but even in past seasons, he's been more than capable. He's probably been the best mid laner in the NACL for the past couple of years, and so, you know, I really like him, but Ruby is the one that's slated to start here for TSM. He's coming over from Heretics, and he's really not had a good year. I mean, I liked him a little bit as a player coming out of UOL in the ERLs, but he just has not, you know, adapted well, I would say, to top-level competition. He's basically been a one-trick on Cassiopeia. Basically, all of his good games have been on that champion, and it's good for him that that champion is still strong, but we've seen it be banned out against him, and he doesn't really hold up in almost any other matchup, especially if other mid laners are trying to skill check him. He doesn't necessarily hold up in that regard. He was easily the worst mid laner in the LEC across the year so far, and so I don't really like this pickup for TSM. I think, especially going from a player like Maple, who you had last split, who I think had easily his best split in the LCS in spring, going from him to Ruby, you know, Maple was your big win condition, especially for the beginning part of spring where you were looking really, really good. Maple was honestly super underrated as a carry last split, and bringing, you know, going from that to Ruby, I think really hurts this team a lot. That, in my opinion, is the biggest reason why this team is going from 7th in terms of their standings to 9th in terms of my power rankings. I think mid lane is going to be a much bigger gap, and I just don't think Ruby is going to be able to make that up. Now, again, if Insanity plays more of the split, I feel more confident in Insanity than I do in Ruby, and so I think that would, you know, generally be able to push them back over the top, back into, like, you know, around that 7th or 8th place, but I think with Ruby in there, I'm definitely a little bit more concerned. And then you've got the bot lane of Wild Turtle and Chime. Everybody knows I like Chime. I'm going to start with him first. He's a really, really solid player, and I think if he was on a better team, people would recognize it a bit more. He's really aggressive. He loves to roam, and he loves to play with his jungler. We saw that a lot in 2022 when Spica was still on this team. Those two were really doing everything in their power to win TSM games, and everybody else was just kind of running it down, but he did take a little bit of a step back in 2023. Not that that was entirely unexpected. You know, him and Neo just never really clicked for most of the split, and then eventually when Wild Turtle did get added, they looked a lot better because Wild Turtle is better as a bot laner, and I think if Chime gets a full split, a full year of actually playing with a competent bot laner, a jungler who does want to play a little bit more aggressive, I think that would be good overall. I'm not necessarily sure that Boogie is the best jungler to maximize what Chime does at a really high level, but I still really like Chime as a player, and again, I think if he was on a different org, an org that actually invested in their talent, I think that he could genuinely be one of the more interesting supports in the entire region, but that's unfortunately just not the case. And then you've got Wild Turtle in the bot lane, was promoted towards the end of last split, and looked pretty good in his time at the LCS level. I'm not exactly sure that's going to be entirely sustainable. Again, he's going to probably have to be the main carry for this team. They're going to have to transition from playing through Maple in the mid lane to playing through Wild Turtle in the bot lane, and so his, ability to carry games, I think, is going to matter a lot, and unfortunately, I think just compared to a lot of the other hyper carry ADCs in the LCS right now, a role that I think really expanded itself throughout spring, I just don't know if he's necessarily going to hold up for an entire split. He was mediocre at best in the NACL. He looked a lot better once he got to the LCS, but I just don't know where to land on him. If he ends up being a lot higher than this number 9 spot, I'm not going to be entirely surprised, and I think that could be another avenue for TSM to get out of this bottom 2, but if he does end up being a lower tier AD carry, someone who is given a lot of resources, but doesn't have the team around him to be able to carry his team to a win, I could definitely see him, fitting right into this number 9 ranking, and I think that's where I'm going to land ultimately, which is why I have this team at number 9 and at the top of D tier. I would expect them to be one of the 2 teams to not end up making top 8, and it's not all that surprising. When you know the investment that this organization is making into the LCS, it's not surprising to see them not really put out a team that's all that good. Again, I think the mid lane downgrade is going to matter a lot if Ruby does end up playing towards the back half of the split, and as much as I do think that Haunter and Wild Turtle are good players, I don't think they're massive enough upgrades for me to feel like they're canceling out the downgrade that you're getting in the mid lane, and so TSM ends up falling down to number 9, and with what looks like the last split that TSM is going to spend in the LCS, it's pretty apropos and, pretty poetic that I think they would be one of the teams to end up not making the playoffs. All right, now that bottom 2 are out of the way, the 2 teams that I am personally predicting to not make the playoffs, which of course is top 8 in summer, it's time to jump into the C tier. We're going from D tier to C tier. The big difference, obviously, D tier being teams that I don't really expect to be in that top 8. Again, I think realistically, either of the 2 bottom teams could figure something out and get in there. They definitely have the pieces to be able to kind of figure it out and get in there. But these are the teams that I think have some interesting pieces. These aren't teams that I think are ever going to compete for world spots, but I do think that they are interesting nonetheless, and they should have moments throughout the season where they look relatively intriguing as a team. And kicking us off in C tier at the bottom of it, and coming in at number 8 in my power rankings, it is going to be Dignitas. They do come in at number 8, which is, quite frankly, an upgrade over what they were showing off in spring. They were the worst team in the LCS in spring by a considerable margin. They just never really got it together, which was pretty unacceptable for this roster. There were so many veterans on here, so many players that really weren't playing up to their standards, and we'll talk about them as we go throughout this roster, but I feel a little bit more confident and comfortable with the roster that they're going to be putting out in summer, especially in terms of recent performances about some of the players that they are committing to, and I'll talk about why I think this team is a lot better than they were in spring and why the results will probably back that up. But their lineup is looking like Rich in the top lane, Santorin in the jungle, Jensen in the mid lane, Tomo at AD carry, and Diamond at support. Intriguing lineup for sure. A couple of changes here. Obviously, top and support are brand new, at least considering what they had in the last split. And then Tomo came in towards the back half of last split as well, so he's kind of getting a new ranking here, if you will. It's really just jungle mid returning from the beginning of spring split when everybody was talking about this team as, a potential top 6 team in the league. Obviously, that didn't pan out, but let's go ahead and talk about why I have more confidence in this team in summer. We're going to start with Rich in the top lane. He ends up replacing Armut here, and I think this is just generally an upgrade on every front. Now, I'm not the biggest Rich fan in the world. Anybody who has followed the channel knows that. In fact, I've been very vocal about how I think Ninjas in Pajamas went in the right direction going with a player like Invincible over Rich. I think Rich very much has his playstyle. He has the things that he is good at. They're not always going to be great for winning at the highest level, though. He is a horrendous laner. He is awful for the first 10, 15 minutes of the game. He just doesn't really understand when and how to trade. His early game ability is just not very good. It's basically every part of the early game, whether that be helping out his jungler, get pressure on the top side, or whether it be, just the 1v1 in the top lane or avoiding ganks. All of it, he's just not very good at. The good thing about Rich is he's one of the better team fighters coming out of the top lane in the entire world. Obviously, you know, coming from Heroes of the Storm, he's going to be a little bit more of a team fight oriented player. That's kind of just how that game ends up operating, and I think he's really, really good at that section of the game. I'm not going to deny that. He was positive for Victory 5 last year, but he did get exposed once this team got to best of fives, and so he hasn't really played all that much in 2023, but I think of all the leagues for him to succeed in, I tweeted about this when he got signed, I think the LCS is probably the league that he's going to have the most success in, not only just because, you know, the talent level is generally a little bit lower here in the LCS than it would be in, you know, the LPL and the LCK and even the LEC, right? But I think that stylistically, he fits well with how the LCS likes to play the game. We're one of the slowest regions, especially one of the slowest major regions in the entire world, and I think that Rich definitely fits into a region that wants to play a little bit slower, that isn't going to be super proactive through the top lane early on in games. He's basically Diet Impact. That's kind of what I've compared him to over the past few years, and I think he'll fit into Dignitas in a very similar way. He's certainly not going to be a carry for this team, again, especially in the early game, but I think he's going to be more positive than Armut, specifically because I think he's going to be more reliable in the section of the game that is the most important in this particular region. And then you talk about the mid-jungle duo. They're the two that are kind of being carried over from the entire year so far, Santorin and Jensen. They were supposed to be the two, you know, big acquisitions, the big surprise signings for a team like Dignitas to be able to pull off. But, you know, one of them I think has played relatively well, the other not so much. We're going to talk about Santorin first, and man, he comes in at number 6 in my jungle rankings. If we're just going off of Spring, he should be significantly lower. He was one of the worst junglers, if not the worst jungler in the league in Spring. I mean, he was just no pressure, behind in CS every game, no ganks, power farming, just, I mean, a complete AFK non-factor. And I think you can attribute a lot of that to the fact that none of his lanes were really doing all that well in the early game, but still, even when he had pressure coming out of some of these lanes, he wasn't really able to do anything with it. This was the worst split of Santorin's career, in my opinion, and that doesn't give me a ton of confidence that he's going to be able to rebound. However, it is Santorin. This is somebody who's been a very good jungler at this level for a long time, even in the LEC or back in the EU LCS, right? He was a competent jungler at this level, and just because he had one bad split doesn't mean I'm going to completely write him off as a player. It's just worth noting that he was horrendously bad. He honestly didn't get enough like credit for how many losses I think he gave Dignitas. And I know I hate to rag on a player, but it's okay to have one bad split so long as you keep your confidence and are able to bounce back from it. It's just important to kind of recognize, I think, where he is standing going into the split, which is not exactly in the best form possible. And then you've got Jensen in the mid lane. Jensen was fine. He was exactly what I think we all thought he would be, or at least what I thought he would be going into the year. He was a solid player, but a lot of the worries that I had with Jensen did end up emerging. He's just not the player that's going to be able to carry a bad team across the finish line. He's not Jensen from 2018 anymore. He's just not going to be able to do that. He is solid. If you put good talent around him, he's going to be one of the more premier secondary carries in the entire league, and especially as a facilitator coming out of the mid lane role, I think he can be a really high-level version of that, but if you're relying on him to be your best player, I just don't think you're going to be able to win a lot of games, and unfortunately, that's what Dignitas kind of had to do last split, and I'm worried that they're going to have to do it again. Now, we'll talk about it, but the addition of this bot lane, or kind of the integration of this bot lane into the main roster, I do think helps out Jensen's role a lot. They were kind of the focal point carries of Dignitas challengers, and I think that that's a really good sign that they know how to play with pressure, they know how to play strong side. Hopefully Jensen can get back to that role that he was really good at on Cloud9 last year, which is that more facilitator, someone who plays for his jungler, can try to get them ahead, and then make a lot of four-man plays bot. That's what Jensen always does at a super high level, and I think that would again be the bright spot for what Dignitas would be able to do. Jensen is still a very good player, and he would look so much better on a good team, but again, I don't think he's this super carry that's going to be able to drag a bad team across the finish line. But then you get to the bot lane, and this is where there is upside for me, you know, regardless of the fact that they rank kind of low. Ignore those rankings, like legitimately ignore those rankings. The only reason that they rank so low, Tomo, just because again, I think talent-wise, he's relatively middle of the pack in terms of like mechanics, but he performed at a very high level when he got called up in Spring, and I think generally speaking, he's exactly what this team needs, which is an aggressive AD carry. He's someone who is going to continuously look for plays. He's not Spawn, who, as much as I like Spawn kind of lets the game come to him a little bit more than I think other players do, but Tomo is definitely more aggressive, and I think he fits with this team a little bit better. And then Diamond, certainly not going to be the number 10 support The only reason he comes in here at number 10 is because he hasn't had a great LCS career up until this point. He's been given opportunities on FlyQuest before, and it hasn't necessarily worked out at a super high level, but if you're just going off of his NACL tape, like, he is easily probably a top 6-ish support in the region, maybe top 5, like somewhere around there. He's a really good player. It's going to be interesting to see these two finally get called up because they have great synergy together. Obviously, they played on FlyQuest a little bit over the past few years, but this is really going to be their first big test at the LCS level, their first, like, where you guys are actually starters and there's not really a competition at the LCS level, and so I'm really confident that these two are going to be able to produce well, and that alongside the fact that I think Jensen's going to be great at facilitating Tomo and Diamond to be able to get ahead. Rich is hopefully going to be a little bit more solid than what Armit was in the top lane, and you're kind of hoping for a Santorin bounce back. All of those factors contribute to me thinking that they're going to be better than the bottom 2 teams in the league that I just don't think have the same kind of upside. Now, they still are coming in at 8th because I do have to admit, like, there were moments where a lot of this was true over the course of the spring split. They just couldn't do it with any sort of consistency, and that was the big problem. If they can do it with consistency here in summer, I do think that they're going to be better than 8th, but this is the nice middle ground for, you know, how they competed in spring and how I think their talent level actually represents. This team realistically could get top 6 by the end of the regular season. They still have the talent to be able to pull that off. I'm not going to go as far as saying that that is going to be something that I'm going to predict, right? They're going to come in the playoff spots, but right at the bottom of those playoff spots, at the bottom of C tier for me, at number 8 in the power rankings. Moving on to the top 7 now. We are coming in at number 7 here, and this is going to be the final team outside of the top 6. Not that top 6 really matters all that much anymore, but of course 7 and 8 do enter the bracket in lower bracket immediately in playoffs, and so this is the final team that I believe will be doing that. This team comes in smack dab right in the middle of C tier, and so a team that, well, I do think has promise. I think certainly has not lived up to that promise up till this point in the season already, and I think that will continue. Coming in at number 7 for me, it is going to be Team Liquid. And this might surprise a few people because I've seen this team ranked a lot higher by quite a few other analysts, but I just don't have a lot of confidence that the mistakes and the worries and the things that they weren't doing all that well in spring are just going to change, because I think a lot of it is playstyle issues between the players on this team in particular. I think a lot of them, you know, want to play a lot of different ways, and I just don't think it meshes all that well together. Of course, you know, bringing in a player like Rainover to be your new coach, that's going to help a lot. He's been really successful as a coach in the past for quite a variety of different organizations, and I think that he's going to do a better job than someone like Marin, who really hadn't had a lot of experience doing that up until this point. And so, you know, maybe you can bring some stuff out of these players that wasn't necessarily there in spring, but I'm not necessarily counting on that. And honestly, I'm really not counting on that more than some of the teams that I have listed above them. So let's go ahead and go over what their roster is looking like. It's the exact same roster that they trotted out in spring, the first team that we've talked about so far to do that. They've got Summit in the top lane, Pioshik in the jungle, Harry in the mid lane, Yon at AD carry, and Core JJ at support. A lot of good and a lot of bad. Again, mechanically, like, this team is incredible. We had this team power ranked, I believe, 4th in the preseason, and so there were a lot of positives to talk about when it came to this team on paper. I just think that a lot of these players ended up underperforming quite a bit in spring, and I don't really see a lot of reason for that to change. And that really does start with the top side of the map for me. Summit and Pioshik, I'm going to kind of group them together, not because, again, imports deserve to be grouped together, but I think they play a very similar style, and I think that, honestly, they don't complement each other all that well, and I think that was a big reason why they did end up struggling, is both of these players have been very used to getting resources on their teams over the past few years. Summit has always been kind of the focal carry on basically every team that he's played for, going back to Sandbox, whether it been on Cloud9 when he was the MVP, and then Fun Plus Phoenix, you know, last year, even on Team Liquid. Like, it definitely is a playstyle that he has gotten very used to, being this very resource-heavy top laner, and that's just not really how Team Liquid wanted to play the game, and so he was left on an island a lot more than I think he was comfortable with. He was still dominating early laning phases because, mechanically speaking, like, he's just the best laner in the region, and it's not particularly close. The problem is that he would almost assuredly throw that lead away in some weird play towards the back half of the game, and it happened almost every single game, and I can't really tell you why it ended up happening. It really did feel like he was just on a different page than everybody else on the team, but he would go in by himself and die, and it would just happen constantly, and so he's going to fall all the way to my number 7 top laner. And the same thing basically happened for Pioshik. He was just super inconsistent over the course of the entire split. This is kind of a victory lap for me, and I hate to say that because, I've gone on record in the past saying that Pioshik's probably my favorite player in the world to watch, and I was really excited for him to come to North America. I thought he was going to be a really fun player in interviews and, just in the culture, here, for content and everything. I thought it was going to be pretty great to have a player like Pioshik in the league, but his problems and the things that I was worried about at the beginning of the year all came true. And, again, I don't mean to, I try not to brag a ton on this channel, but I had a ton of comments in my preseason power rankings that were calling me stupid for putting Pioshik as low as, I believe, 3rd in terms of my jungle rankings at the beginning of the year because he had just come off of winning the World Championship. Obviously, he was going to smurf on NA. And I was like, guys, let's take a step back here. There's a lot of worries about his playstyle converting into North America. He's really aggro. He was already really inconsistent in the LCK. Even in the year that DRX did win Worlds, he was very inconsistent. He ended up getting benched on the way to the World Championship. He was unbenched at Worlds, but it was something worth noting that this wasn't, Prince coming over where it was just like such a no-brainer that he was going to be a good player. Pioshik had his question marks, and unfortunately, that did end up coming true. The inconsistencies were there. He got better as the split went on. That is something I want to point out, but for the first, I want to say 4 or 5 weeks of the season, he was a bottom 2, bottom 3 jungler in the league, and so hopefully you can get a better version of him. He really did not work well at all with Harry in the mid lane, and him and Summit just have very contradictory playstyles because, again, both players want the other to play for them, and it's not necessarily what either really want to do, and so hopefully you can figure out some of the issues there. But then you have Harry in the mid lane. He's exactly who I thought he was going to be. Again, no flame towards Harry. He's just fine, right? He's not going to be a superstar at this level. I just don't know if he has the mechanical talent to do so. He is definitely the weak side, quote-unquote, player of this team. He was often asked to give up a ton of resources in order to get his jungler ahead, and then later in the game to get his bot laner ahead. And so, I'm fine with my placement of him at 9. I think that's relatively fine. I think in a better league where you had, more competitive talent in the mid lane, he probably should be number 10. Again, not that he's an awful player at the LCS level. I think he's really interesting. He's just never going to be the one to get a ton of spotlight here on Liquid, and that's by design, I think, with the rest of the players on this team. And then the positives that I have for this team are the bot lane. Yeon and Core JJ were easily the best part of this team across spring. They were often the players that were stepping up the most when this team was winning, and I have a lot of feeling that that's going to continue because that's just what Core JJ does. Now, he is going to fall to number 3 in terms of my support rankings because individually, I don't think he's making nearly as many highlight plays as he is in the past, right, or even as some of the players above him currently are, but you cannot take away the impact that he has on the game. He has made every bot laner that he has played with look better for playing with him, with the exception of Hansama, but obviously, very weird year last year in 2022, but you look at, Doublelift, you look at Tactical, you look at Yeon, every player has kind of looked better for playing with Core JJ in North America, and that definitely, lived up to expectation in spring, and I like Yeon as a player. I think he's a more than capable starting LCS bot laner. He comes in at number 7 for me, but that's only because I think there were so many bot laners that impressed in spring. It was a very bot-centric meta. I think a lot of those players got a lot of chance to shine, and Yeon was definitely one of them. I think he could continue to climb up these rankings quite a bit. If he was a top 4-ish bot laner by the end of the year, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. That's kind of the influence that Core JJ has, and, Core's still a really good player. He's gotten better at enchanters, but he still is very much an engager, someone who wants to get out on the map and roam, kind of a better version of Chime that I talked about earlier for TSM. That's kind of how Core JJ likes to play the game, except he's a little bit more competent in the 2v2 in laning phase, but Yeon's a very fun player, and honestly, Team Liquid probably should play for him more. I understand that the idea is to get Summit ahead and to make sure Pioshik has resources, but this team was at its best, in my opinion, in spring when Yeon was getting a lot of resources, and he was pretty consistent at being a good team fighter in the late game. I do think that's probably their best path to victory, but again, the reason they come in here at 7th and not any higher with the talent that I just talked about is I just don't think they're going to settle on a good playstyle. I don't think these players mesh all that well in terms of playstyles, and I think it's going to affect their ability to win games consistently. Now, can they be higher than this? Can they be 5th or 6th or even 4th or something like that? Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. If Summit has a really good split, if Pioshik has a really good split, and if Yeon and Core continue to take a step up, they could be a top 4-ish team in the LCS. I just don't know if their ceiling is high enough, to where their expectations were, I think, at the beginning of the year. If you would have told me that the best this team could probably hope for is 3rd or 4th place at the beginning of the year, maybe at best contentious for a world spot, that's probably not where they were looking for. They probably wanted to be one of the more intriguing teams in the league, and I just don't think that has panned out up until this point. And honestly, if I had to take a guess, if I had to put my money on it, I would honestly bet on this team continuing to struggle as we move into Summer Split, which is why they come in at 7th and not any higher. A couple of the teams above them are going to be a little bit contentious in terms of maybe public opinion, but for me, I just don't have a ton of faith that this Team Liquid team is going to be able to turn it around in summer. Moving on now to our top 6 teams here in the LCS, or my predicted top 6 teams in my power rankings. Couple of things before we jump into the segment. First of all, obviously, top 6 not nearly as important here in summer as it was in spring. In spring, you needed to be top 6 in order to make playoffs. You know, in summer, it's only top 8, so that's pretty good, but you still want to be in that top 6 so you can get into the upper bracket. Also, if my voice sounds a little bit different, I actually took basically a week in between the first 4 teams and these last teams in the recording because I got pretty sick and I just wasn't able to finish the video, so I apologize if it sounds a little bit different. But jumping into our top 6 now, coming in at number 6 in my power rankings and at the top of the C tier, the best team in the C tier, a team that I have a little bit higher than maybe some other people. I have Evil Geniuses coming in at 6, and really, I mean, I can see the reason why a lot of people are really low on this team and really low on this org right now, but there are still a lot of positives when it comes to EG that I think people just aren't talking about in the way that they need to. Yes, they blew up their roster. Yes, everything is different from spring, except for their mid lane position, but honestly, like, a lot of the changes that they ended up making aren't ones that I would consider to be massive downgrades. In fact, I think that there is room for this team to be just as interesting as old Evil Geniuses was. I'm not necessarily going to predict that because I think the consistency of this team is certainly not where that team was in spring, but there are definitely some positives, and that's the reason they come in the top 6 for me. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Revenge in the top lane, Armeo in the jungle, Jojo Pune in the mid lane, Unforgiven in the AD carry position, and Ayla at support. There is definitely still a lot of good on this team. I know people are going to look at it and say, like, oh, you know, all the talented players that they brought in that really made them a pseudo-contender, you know, got them 4th place in the spring and really had upside to be much better than that in the summer. All of those pieces are gone, but you know, even if that is true, I think they did replace a lot of those players with competent LCS caliber players and players that I do think deserve a shot and maybe haven't gotten the best experience on other organizations in their time in the LCS, and that definitely starts in the top lane here with Revenge, who has been on Immortals his entire career here in the LCS, and he's never really been given a fair shake. He's been one of the more interesting players in that organization for the past 2 years, but they really have not been able to produce a team that's even remotely competitive at any point that he has been on it, and so it's really hard to understand exactly where his skill level is, but honestly, it feels like he's taken a lot of strides, a lot of steps in the right direction over the past few splits, and he just continues to get better. He's an incredibly talented laner, and I think that's definitely his strength as a player. He's someone who is going to be able to generate quite a few leads for himself in the early game, but he needs to be able to clean up the consistency of translating a lot of those leads into mid-game pressure. Now, obviously, I think playing with, you know, these more experienced players on the team, Armeo and Unforgiven in particular, I think is going to help him a lot. These are players that are relatively well known for being able to transition their leads, and so hopefully Revenge can learn a bit and maybe get a few more resources. But if you do have a worry for Revenge, especially replacing somebody like Someday on this roster, it's that they're basically the exact opposite in terms of playstyle. Someday was very low resource, somebody who you could leave on an island and you could kind of, you know, respect and understand and know that he might be down 10 CS or whatever because he's getting camped, but if he's isolated in the 1v1, he's going to be just fine. He's more than talented enough to be able to survive, and he's going to be great in team fights. Revenge is not that kind of player. He's somebody who is going to want some resources, and again, that's not necessarily a problem, especially for a team that is going to be looking for an identity, but a lot of players on this team, I think, are going to be wanting resources. It's going to be interesting to see if Revenge gets them, or if they move to other locations, you know, if they move to the mid lane, if they move to the bot lane. Certainly going to be intriguing, but for Revenge, this is a player that, again, has only consistently gotten better over the course of his LCS career, and this is really going to be his big test. This is the first team that has legitimate top, you know, 4, top 5 potential that he has been on in the LCS. I'm not saying that they're going to be there, but it'll be interesting to see how he adapts. And then you've got Armeo in the jungle. Certainly an intriguing addition here. He had moved to coaching over the beginning part of the split. He had been playing on Team Liquid Academy for the past few years, and, you know, obviously we know how good that team had been. Pretty much everybody on that team is now in the LCS. In fact, everybody with the exception of, you know, top lane, you know, being Bradley, is now in the LCS, and that does include Armeo, you know, with him joining EG here. He's a solid enough player. I'm not nearly as sold on him being like a superstar at the LCS level as maybe some diehard NACL fans are. I think he's a really solid pather. He's somebody who takes advantage of early mistakes incredibly well, but I'm not sure that that's going to translate as dominantly to the LCS as it did to the NACL. He's still a really good player, but I'm not necessarily sure he's a superstar. Again, I think this is a good addition because what he has been showing over the past few years in Academy, you know, not in the NACL because it wasn't existing back then, but, you know, in that Academy scene for a really good team has been very encouraging. He was one of the big reasons why that team was able to function at such a high level, because his early and mid games were so consistent. But it's going to be interesting to see if that can translate, especially after, basically taking the entire spring split off in terms of playing pro. And so definitely an intriguing addition, but one that I'm certainly not entirely against. And then you've got the one player that actually is remaining here on this Evil Geniuses team, and that is Jojo Pune in the mid lane. He's kind of the face of the franchise at this point for this team, the big up-and-coming, young, North American prodigy talent. It makes a ton of sense to be able to hang on to him, unless you were able to find someone that was offering a ridiculous amount of money. But even then, you should probably just build around him as your superstar. Worth noting, he probably had his worst split in the LCS in spring. It's only been 3 splits, but it was probably worse than any split he had as a rookie this past spring, and so definitely some worries there. That's why he's going to drop all the way down to number 4 in my mid lane rankings, but at the end of the day, it's still Jojo Pune. Mechanically speaking, he's right up there with anybody else in the region. It's just going to be about consistency for him. When he's on his, A game, when he's playing well, he's like player of the week every single week kind of player. He's an MVP caliber player, but the inconsistencies that we saw were astounding. There were some weeks in spring where he was just unplayable in the mid lane, actively losing his team games, really bad engages, over-aggression, not playing with his teammates. There were a lot of question marks from him in terms of the mental side of the game. Now, those are the things that can be fixed up, I would say, a lot more easily than, the mechanical mistakes, because he doesn't really make a ridiculous amount of mechanical mistakes. It's usually just over-trusting in his abilities, and that's something that I think he can clean up. Obviously, this is someone who's had a lot of success in his time in the LCS already, but he's going to be relied upon a ton on this team. He definitely is the face of the franchise now, and I think EG is going to play for that. I think they are going to give him a lot of resources. I think they are going to trust in him to be the main carry of this team. Obviously, you've got other players on this team that aren't afraid to carry games. Revenge, we talked about. We'll get to Unforgiven in a minute, but I think Jojo really is going to make or break what this Evil Geniuses team can do. If he can get back into that 2022 form where he was slowly rising as one of the best mid laners in North America and, at such a young age continuing to grow, I think if you get that version of Jojo, this team is going to be top 6. It doesn't really matter that the surrounding core is maybe a little less proven than what they had last split. If Jojo can get back to form, then that's going to be great. But if he can't, if he continues to be really inconsistent and honestly at times a little bit of a detriment to this team, then I'm not really sure that the 6th place ranking is going to be accurate. A lot of this team's success relies on Jojo being that kid that we all know as the prodigy to enter the LCS and, continuing to grow to become one of the league's best players. I have faith that he is going to be able to do it, which is why I have them ranked here, but I do have to give them a little bit of leeway, which is why they only come in at number 6. And then you've got the bot lane here. I'm actually really excited about this bot lane. I haven't heard a lot of people talking about it as a big, positive for this team, but Unforgiven and Ayla are a ridiculously talented bot lane. 2 players that have smurfed the tier 2 system in North America in recent years, and Unforgiven obviously was really good in the LEC last year. Honestly, underratedly good. He gets underrated in general. I think a lot of players from that Mad Lions team last year ended up being like that, but people have really fallen off on Ayla as well because he didn't have a great spring split for FlyQuest, but potential-wise, this could be one of the best bot lanes in the region. It really isn't out of the realm of possibility for these two to be that. Unforgiven coming over to 100 Thieves in the offseason, probably felt like he was going to take Doublelift's job. I assume that's why he took that position on 100 Thieves, but didn't end up happening. Doublelift actually had a really good split, and so Unforgiven ends up sticking in the NACL for the entirety of spring and then finally gets a job here. And honestly, him versus FBI, I honestly don't think that's a major downgrade for this team at all. Unforgiven, at his best, is one of the more interesting AD carries in the West, and, we haven't seen a ton of him at a high level. We've only really seen that 1 year from him in 2022, but that 2022 was really, really good for him, and so if he can get back to that form, I feel pretty confident that that's going to be a pretty decent side grade for Evil Geniuses. I'm pretty high on FBI. We'll get to that in a bit, but Unforgiven's a good player, and I certainly don't want it to seem like a negative that they added him. And then Ayla, I'm not going to give up on Ayla. He's still going to come in at number 6 in terms of my support rankings. Last split was a disaster for him, but really, the circumstance was set up for him to fail. When you talk about someone who was entering a team that was, very, very much clicking and had already developed their own synergy and, had learned how to communicate, and he had to come in and basically replace a primary shot caller for the team, midway through the year as they were surging, it's a very difficult role to slot a rookie into, and, he wasn't able to kind of adapt to that nearly as well as I think a lot of people hoped, but that's okay. I think you give him an offseason to actually mesh and gel with the team and form his own community communication lines and, you know, form a way for the team to be able to communicate around him, I think he's going to be a lot better. I think that obviously the situation with FlyQuest was really unfortunate, but getting him here on Evil Geniuses, I think this could be a really good landing spot for him, and especially with Unforgiven in the bot lane, that could be a super scary duo if both of them live up to their potential. And so there is a lot of that on this team. Potential. That's the word that you've got to use for Evil Geniuses. That's the reason they come in so high, is because they're a little bit higher in terms of potential than any of the teams that we've talked about up until this point. Even Team Liquid, even, you know, Dignitas with the new additions. Evil Geniuses to me feels like a team that can rise above all of that if Jojo Pune gets back to form, if Revenge continues to turn that corner and prove that he deserves to be on an upper tier team, if Unforgiven is that, you know, player in the LEC, if Ayla is the NACL god that we had a lot of faith in, and if Armeo is the one facilitating it all in the jungle, there is a lot that could go right for this team, but again, it has to go right. There isn't a lot of middle ground for what this team is going to be able to do. I have them ranked here at number 6, but realistically, they could go a lot higher or a lot lower than this. Now we get to move on to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is where we start to get to teams that I think legitimately could make a case for being top 3 if everything were to go right. We've only got 2 tiers left. The end of C tier just happened with Evil Geniuses topping out at number 6, but this is going to be the beginning of my B tier. If C tier were teams that really wanted to compete, should be making top 8, but weren't necessarily the most consistent, B tier are going to be teams that definitely should be top 6, teams that I think have aspirations of potentially being top 3, potentially, you know, top 4, depending on how Worlds qualifications goes, and, you know, have opportunities to be making it to the World Championships this year from North America, obviously, should everything end up, you know, shooting off and players be playing games with everything. But kicking off that B tier for me, coming in at number 5 in my power rankings, it is going to be NRG, formerly, of course, Counter Logic Gaming, selling their spot to NRG here for summer, and inheriting most of the roster that CLG ended up having. They're going to come in at number 5 for me. This, again, might be a little bit higher than other people are expecting. You know, you might expect to see a team like Team Liquid a little bit higher than number 7, and teams like Evil Geniuses and NRG a little bit lower, but I actually have a lot of faith in this team. I think that there were a couple of really good changes and additions to this team in the offseason, and I know a lot of people are a little bit upset that they did end up making those changes, especially after, you know, promising to play the original roster, and I'll kind of get to those, but I like the way that this roster is constructed. I think they have a very clear play style, and I think that there are a lot of players on this team that are going to benefit from the changes that were made. And so let's go ahead and talk about it. NRG in 2023 summer is looking like Dokla in the top lane, Contracts in the jungle, Palafox in the mid lane, FBI at AD carry, and Ignar at support. A lot of really good talent on this team. Players that I think are generally underrated by the community, which is why I have this NRG team higher. I think at this point, these players have proven that they are a good collection of talent. This team was brought together by CLG last year as a big youth initiative, a big NACL passion project for the team, and it absolutely ended up working out, especially in summer, and a lot of that carried over into spring, where, yes, at times they did look relatively inconsistent, but a lot of times they looked like that team that we all were hoping that we would see out of them in the spring split. So why do I have confidence that they're going to continue that in summer? Well, it's all going to start on a lot of the players that they ended up keeping, the 3 players on the top side that they ended up keeping, Dokla, Contracts, and Palafox, all of whom I'm higher on, I think, than the general consensus. Maybe not Contracts, but we'll get to that in a minute. Dokla, I definitely am. I really like Dokla a lot as a player. I think his upside and his potential is like a top 3, top 4 top laner in the region. And like I said before in this video, I think top lane is probably the most contentious and deep role in the LCS at the current moment. And so that's certainly not a negative towards Dokla, an incredibly good player, someone who you absolutely can play through out of that role. And really, he does it super successfully. Obviously, his Aurelia is very well known, but he's great on basically every carry champion, and I honestly think he's underrated as a tank player on the top side as well. If you need him to be weak side, he can be a really good weak side player. Sometimes he can get a little bit too over aggressive, but for the most part, you are more than happy to make that trade. He's a really good player at this level, and NRG are going to be incredibly happy to have him. He was a big carry for them in the spring. You know, the solo laners, I would say, were definitely the driving force for this team in a lot of the spring, and so we'll talk about that in a bit. And then you've got Contracts in the jungle. This is somebody who obviously has been around the LCS for quite a bit, but continues to be the player that we all know and love. Some games he's going to absolutely pop off and carry this team. Some other games he's going to look pretty bad and just kind of lead the league in deaths kind of series, that kind of thing, right? But Contracts is incredibly talented, and honestly, he's really cut down on a lot of the major mistakes that he was making early on his career. I think that his synergy with Palafox and with Dokla in particular on the top side of the map has really helped him out a lot. Those three always seem to be on the same page in terms of the plays that they want to make, and I do think that it really does help enable a player like Contracts who wants to go for a lot of these early aggressive plays. He's been able to pull a lot of them off. Now again, he's not going to be the most consistent jungler in the entire world, but ranking him at number 5 in terms of the jungle rankings, I think is more than fair. He's going to produce like a relatively good jungler at this level. You know, some games he's going to be a lot better than that, some games he's going to be a lot worse than that. You don't exactly know what you're going to get game to game from him, but for the most part, it's going to be a positive, especially in comparison to a lot of the other junglers in the region that just haven't been consistent in more of a negative way over the past year or so. And then you get to Palafox in the mid lane. Talk about a player who I think is crazy underrated by the community. He has, quite frankly, been nothing short of a top 3 mid both of the last 2 splits, and I don't know how long that's going to keep up. A couple of players have been underperforming over the past few splits, but Palafox just gets the job done. He kind of falls into that category that definitely gets a little bit propped up on this channel of players who are really good at melee mids and then have to expand their pool out from there. Palafox is definitely a part of that club, you know, with Certus in the LEC, with Zeka in the LCK, with, you know, Cream in the LPL. There are so many players that have become channel darlings, I guess you could say, that kind of fall into that category, but Palafox is much more than that. This team relied on him a lot, especially down the stretch of the split, and I definitely think he paid it out. He consistently wins lane. He's super active on the map. He plays really well with Contracts. He's basically just everything you want out of a mid laner at the LCS level, and I don't think he gets talked about enough in terms of the best mids in the LCS. I think he absolutely deserves to be in that conversation. He has shown that consistency for multiple splits in a row now, and so I don't have any worry about Palafox. I don't really have a ton of worry about Dokla. Contracts is going to give you some bad games, but he's also going to counterbalance that out with a lot of positives. So top side of the map, I'm not worried about. And then, honestly, I like the bot lane here. I think that there are a lot of good moments for this bot lane. I think that, you know, obviously some people are a little bit upset that Luger and Poom are out here and that FBI and Ignar are in, but you know, if you follow the channel, you know I like FBI quite a bit as a player. He's going to come in at number 3 in terms of my ADC rankings, and some people might see that as too high, but all this guy has done ever since coming over here to the LCS is consistently be a top tier AD carry in every facet of the game. He's a solid laner. That was his strength when he first entered the league on Golden Guardians, was that he was an incredibly strong laner that just didn't know how to translate his leads. And then on 100 Thieves, he became an incredibly efficient team fighter as well. And now he's just kind of settled into the role of being really good at every facet of the game. He doesn't lose lane hardly ever, and he's really, really good at not making major mistakes in the back half of the game. Is he the most explosive AD carry in the region? No, but he's not really going to make a lot of negative plays, and he can carry games, especially if you invest into him. I actually think this is, relatively speaking, an upgrade, even though I really like Luger. Again, if you go back and look at a lot of the analysis that I've done on this channel, I've been in Luger's corner for quite a long time, and he definitely deserves a spot in the LCS, but FBI is one of those players, one of the few players in the league that I really can't fault them for wanting to play over Luger. He is genuinely one of the better ADCs in the entire league, and I think he's going to fit in really well here on a team with NRG where he doesn't have to be the main, like, hyper carry for the team. You can play towards topside and just allow FBI to be incredibly solid on the bot side, but you're also bringing in Ignar to play support. This one I'm a little bit less jazzed about. I'm not the biggest Poom fan in the entire world. I definitely was a little bit higher on Luger than I was on Poom in terms of individual ability, but Ignar is solid, especially if he can get back into his form. He just has kind of been on a downward trajectory over the past few splits. He was not so good last year. He was the worst support in the league on Immortals in 2022, and obviously the split on Dignitas happened where it felt like nobody really ever had any synergy together, and so I'm not super jazzed about his recent performances, but this is a player that has had success in the past, and this is by far the most talented team that he's been able to play with over the past few years, and so you're hoping that he's going to be able to, you know, rekindle some of that synergy. You know, him and FBI could be a really interesting bot lane. Ignar obviously known for his engage, his hook supports. I think that's definitely what he's most known for. FBI, somebody who has played with a lot of people like that in the past. He comes to mind as a player who definitely likes to value those hook supports, and he's been able to capitalize on that relatively well. This could actually be a good bot lane. I'm not super sold that Ignar is like a superstar, but but I have enough faith in FBI that the bot lane is going to be positive, that this team does come in at number 5. Add that along to the fact that I think topside is generally underrated. I think this NRG team is still going to, again, be better than people expect. They are a top 5 team, in my opinion. They deserve to be in a tier above anybody else that we've mentioned in this video up until this point. And realistically speaking, if this team, really gels, and if FBI, really becomes that guy that we can think he can be, or Palafox takes that next step, or Dokla takes that next step, NRG could be a Worlds team. It's not out of the realm of possibility for this team to be able to make the World Championships in their first split as an organization. I'm not necessarily going to say that's going to happen. That's why they come in at number 5 here, but the upside for a lot of these young North American players is a lot of fun to watch, and I really am cheering for a lot of the players on this team, even if not a lot of people have a lot of faith in the org right now. And now we get to move on to my top 4 in my power rankings. This is really where things start to get interesting, because remember, top 3 teams in the LCS, yes, do qualify for the World Championships automatically, but there is now a big qualifying series between Europe and North America, where the 4th seed from both regions end up going up against each other. So, theoretically, the top 4 teams from NA could be in that World Championship conversation. So, this is the start of my projected World Championship conversation here for North America. Coming in the middle of the B tier, and at number 4 in my power rankings, it is going to be 100 Thieves. They are going to come in at number 4 for me. I think this is a relatively fair ranking considering a little bit of turnover with this roster, but I still got to go off of what I saw in spring. And while there were quite a bit of positives, there were a couple of negatives as well that make me a little bit worried about, this team's potential to be one of the best teams in the entire region. I still think that they're solid and there are upsides to it, but this could be a ranking that goes, well, or this could be a ranking that goes poorly because this team underperforms it. And we'll get into why I believe that in just a little bit, but their roster is looking like Someday in the top lane, Closer in the jungle, Quid in the mid lane, Doublelift at AD carry, and Busio at support. Some good and some bad, again, with this team. A lot of that here in North America, where I like these players, but there are concerns with the consistency with a lot of them. Someday coming back here to 100 Thieves, he leaves for one split and comes back to the org that he has been a part of since their inception. Pretty crazy how much of a lifer Someday has ended up being for 100 Thieves, but this is a good addition for the team. I love Tenacity. I think he's a really good player, and it's an absolute travesty what is happening with him. The fact that he basically has to quit being pro because, the system is broken. It definitely sucks, but Someday's a good player, and I don't want to take that out on him. He definitely doesn't deserve that. Obviously, he's not the player that I said he was going into the split, which, he had been, the best top laner in the region for the past 3 years when you look at that stretch of time. I think consistency-wise, there really wasn't a top laner that was nearly as consistent as he was over the past few years, and he wasn't perfect over the beginning part of spring, but I do think he ended up helping out that Evil Geniuses team a lot. I think getting him back into the building here with 100 Thieves is going to be nothing but a positive for him, and honestly, he could be better for this team. They ended up, 100 Thieves that is, feeling a lot more comfortable with Tenacity towards the back half of the split on tanks in the top lane, on things that weren't going to be nearly as, resource heavy, I should say, in the top lane, and Someday fits that role incredibly well. He's more than happy to be put on tanks, to be isolated in the top lane matchup, and to be a team fight threat, rather than somebody who wants resources in order to be able to carry, and so I think he's going to fit the outlook of this team a little bit better because, what we talked about for 100 Thieves at the beginning of the year definitely came true. They are a team that wants to play for bot lane, and so, definitely I think adding Someday is going to fit into that a little bit better. And then you've got Closer in the jungle. I still got him at number 4 in terms of my jungle rankings, but man, he had a brutal spring split for most of the split. He was the worst player on this team for a considerable amount of last split, in my opinion. And I know not everybody shares that opinion, but I really did not like his pathing. I thought his early games were not good, which has always been his big strength. And he had no synergy with the rest of this team. It took some time. He eventually got there where it felt like him and Doublelift were on a better page. Him and Bjergsen were on a better page, but now you're getting a new mid laner. Hopefully this is going to be a little bit better for his style. He's someone who does like resources for the most part, and I don't think that was necessarily the direction that 100 Thieves wanted to go in. They wanted to play a lot more for bot lane in the early game, and I think Closer was just having a hard time adapting to that. I'm pretty sure that's going to stay in summer, if I'm being entirely honest. That's been a trend with Doublelift over the course of his career, but, Closer, I think, adapted and got a little bit better at playing for bot lane early, giving up resources in the early game as the split went on. You're hoping that progression can maintain, but again, if Closer has another rough split because it's just not a team that necessarily meshes with his playstyle all that well, I'm not really going to be all that surprised. He's a solid player, but someone who does need the right system around him in order to maximize his talent, and I just don't know if that system is in place right now here for 100 Thieves. And then you've got the big new addition here in the mid lane with Quid coming in from the LCK Challengers League. He comes over from Gen G Challengers. A couple of things about Quid. Some people are going to see that number 7 ranking and think it's like way too low. And I had a really hard time placing him on this ranking because there are a couple of proven LCS mid laners that I just wanted to put ahead of him in terms of, track record and everything. Players like Palafox that we just talked about, but Quid has the upside to immediately be better than them basically at everything. And if he's like the number 2 or 3 mid laner in the region basically from day one, I'm not going to be entirely surprised. If for those of you who didn't watch the Challengers League, which I assume is most of you, Quid was on Gen G Challengers, a team that just wasn't very good, but he was like the shining star of that team. He was a superstar on a bad team, and so it's going to be interesting to see if that can translate into a team that maybe isn't going to give him the same kind of resources that Gen G Challengers team did, because really at the end of the day, he was like the shining light of a team that really was struggling in the Challengers League, or at least from what I watched. I wasn't super impressed with anybody else on the team. Quid was just kind of the one carrying them across the finish line, and so, that's a good thing to be, is someone who can carry the game, someone who you can play through, but again, this is a team and that very much wanted to play for bot lane, and so it's going to be interesting to see if he adapts well to that. Also, you never know with communication or adapting to the new environment, how players are going to play, so I am going to underrate him a bit at the beginning of the split. I'm going to be very quick to pull the trigger, though, if he just comes in and is instantly better than a lot of the other players. I'm not going to be surprised at all. He's really talented, but he's never played at a major region level. And I'm not exactly sure if he's, like, perfect for the style of this team, but, again, crazy talented, and so the upside is definitely there, but the volatility is definitely there as well, considering, he wasn't exactly a winner in the Challengers League either, and so then you get to the bot lane, and this is really where the conversation for 100 Thieves is always going to be about. Doublelift and Busio are in the bot lane, and, Doublelift had a great split. I did not expect that in spring. I expected him to have a little bit of rust coming back from the big break, not really playing League a ton in his free time over the past few years, but he really rejoined the league and was immediately like an all-pro caliber bot laner again, which is huge for 100 Thieves. He was given a crazy amount of resources to get there, but if you're going to be able to, pay that out, if you're going to be a top 3-ish team when you give those kind of resources to Doublelift, then that is worth it. However, what we did learn is that when this team doesn't necessarily get to play through that style, they don't really win, and better teams are able to take advantage of that. We saw that in the playoffs, where they didn't win a single series in the playoffs when the bot lane was kind of taken out of the equation. Nobody else was able to kind of take over the game in the same way, and, when Doublelift is set behind, he's not exactly the best AD carry at playing safe in the mid game and, making a lot of plays, being a proactive presence even from behind. He's somebody who does like to snowball the game, and so certainly there are issues, but Doublelift is better than I expected him to be, and if you can continue to put resources into him, he is someone who can give you good output. It's just, I'm a little bit worried about this team being a little bit of a one-trick pony, kind of like they were in spring, and then Busio's a good player. I still think that he's a little bit overrated by members of the community. I think that he is a really good support, but I don't think he's one of the elite supports in the entire region, or at least he hasn't shown me that he is that. Can he be that? Absolutely. When he got Rakan, he was an elite support, but it was just outside of that I really felt a little bit more concerned. And we saw that in the playoffs when teams realized that, oh, we can just ban Rakan against them and, we can stop their win streak doing that. Then I think that he struggled a little bit more. And that was kind of the case for 100 Thieves overall. When they got their main champions taken away from them, they didn't necessarily have a lot of backup plans. And so Doublelift and Busio are a solid bot lane, but the volatility of that, like, I could see a world in which they continue to be really solid in the regular season and, output a lot of good resources and get to top 3 again. But I could also see a world in which teams realize that, if we take away some of their threats and if we make somebody else beat us, that bot lane is going to crumble and collapse. I could see both worlds being true, which is why I said earlier I have them at number 4, but I could absolutely see them being lower than this, them underperforming this ranking. I like the talent on this team. Quid coming in could be a really good addition. Closer hopefully can get his mojo back and be a lot more like the back end of the split rather than he was at the beginning of the split in spring, and Doublelift and Busio hopefully can continue to be a strong lane both in the early and in the mid game, with someday being really stable on the top side, but a lot of those things are question marks, and especially if teams start to capitalize on that playstyle and start to target, basically force 100 Thieves to do something else, I'm not exactly sure this is the most flexible team in the entire world, and so it's going to be interesting to see how this team plays out, but for now, they're going to come in at the middle of B tier and in one of those, play-in world spots at number 4 in my power rankings. And now we get to move on to my top 3 teams in the power rankings. These are the 3 teams that I think are going to qualify for the World Championships coming out of the LCS. So big expectations placed on their shoulders, and if you've counted down, you know the 3 teams that are left, and I don't think they're going to be majorly surprising to anybody considering how recent events have gone, but maybe the order will. Coming in at number 3 in my power rankings and at the top of my B tier, it is going to be Golden Guardians. I think a lot of people are going to want to see this team maybe a little bit higher in terms of the power rankings, but I just can't feasibly put them higher than number 3 here. I still think that they are a good team. I think they made a lot of improvements, and I think they showed a lot of good things that are repeatable over the last month or so, but there are still some questions, and I think the 2 teams at the top really are incredibly dangerous. We'll get to them in a bit, but let's talk about Golden Guardians and why I still do believe that this is going to be a scary team and that they are not going to be an immediate flash in the pan. Their lineup is looking like Licorice in the top lane, River in the jungle, Gory in the mid lane, Stix880 carry, and Huhi at support. A lot of these players took major jumps in spring. It's all going to be about whether or not they can continue to be as proactive as they were. Some of these players have notoriously been better in spring situations than summer situations. That is worth noting, but I feel like the communication that this team has developed and the way that they like to play the game out is incredibly solid at the current moment, and it's something that can be carried over into the summer split, and especially because I think they've gotten so much experience playing together. You know, I expect them to be able to kind of mesh well at the beginning of the split, maybe more so than some of these other teams that have made some drastic changes. So let's go ahead and go down the lineup, starting with Licorice in the top lane. He's going to rank in as my number 4 top laner in the region. Some people might see that as too low. Some people might see that as too high, and I think both can be reasonably correct within reason. Like I said, these numbers are very flexible, but 4 for me feels like right about the right range. He has been better than this, I would say, over the past few weeks, but I have to take into account that, over the past year or so, he has certainly not been the most consistent top laner in the region. There were times going into this year where I was like, is he the worst top laner in North America starting in the LCS right now? Like, that was a genuine concern with Licorice, and there were definitely moments during the regular season where he felt like, I don't want to say a weak link of the team, but someone who just he didn't have his footing, he didn't have his confidence at the time. He was making plays that weren't really connected to the rest of the team, and they were kind of winning away from him, if you will. But I think as the split went on, as he started to gain more confidence back in himself, he kind of grew back into that version that we all loved from him on Cloud9 so many years ago, and he really exploded at MSI. This team obviously going international and getting the chance to play against some of the other teams, from other regions. Licorice looked like the best player on this team at MSI, and that gives me a lot of confidence that the confidence that he gained over the course of the last few weeks is sustainable, and that's really going to transform his game into something that can be a little bit more sustainable overall. And so I like Licorice for this upcoming split. Hopefully he can continue to be a big positive for this team. Again, he can be relatively inconsistent, and when he does get those negative stretches, they do stretch out for a little bit longer than you would hope, but I think overall, you're more than happy, especially with the recent performance of what you're getting out of your top lane here. And then you've got River in the jungle. He has been everything that you could have asked for in this second year on Golden Guardians. Obviously, acquired midway through last year from Dignitas in the summer split, I should say. I was a lot lower on River coming out of summer of last year. I think he was underratedly not good in summer of last year, even if he was good for Dignitas in spring. I thought going into 2023, he certainly wasn't in great form, and I didn't, super love the team around him in terms of being able to enable him, but all of that was thrown out the window. His early games have been spectacular. He's one of the best early game junglers in the entire region, if not the best. He really is super consistent at that part of the game. He knows how to translate leads into the mid game. Obviously, some team fighting mistakes, sometimes he can get a little bit too over eager and engage a little bit too far, but you're more than happy to take that trade-off because he was a huge positive for this team. Now, is it possible that we see some regression out of this jungle role? I do definitely think that that is on the table. That is something that we could potentially see, but River's a player that has been hyped up for his mechanics for a long time, and now it feels like he actually gels with the players around him. I'm expecting him to be able to maintain this, which is why he comes in at number 3 in my jungle rankings. And then the number 2 mid laner coming in with Gory. I think he's an incredibly talented player, somebody who I believe the LCS gave first team All-Pro. I was a little bit hesitant because, again, he didn't play the entire split. He missed the first 4 games, and that's definitely a little bit of a knock, and I do think that they ended up playing away from him for a lot of the second half of the split, which was a little bit concerning, but talent-wise, he's right up there with any other mid laner in the region. I always talk about how mid lane in the LCS isn't exactly the deepest, position for them, but Gory has certainly, grown into a player that I think can dominate this region relatively efficiently. He's great as a carry. He's even better as a supportive mid, and I think that's really where he shines. This team really liked to play through bot lane a lot in the early to mid game. It was very much that kind of meta, and obviously that's the same now. Maybe a little bit of a different way of playing through bot, a little bit slower, but it's still very much a bot-focused meta, and I do think that is, in favor for Gory. I think he's a player who likes to be able to kind of isolate the 1v1, play more of a supportive matchup, and then play with his jungler to try to get the rest of his lanes ahead. He can be a focal point. He can be someone that you play through, that you give resources to, but I think he is just as good playing that supportive role, and I do think he helps this team out a lot. In my opinion, he's the second best player, or at least the second most valuable player on this team, and he comes in as my number 2 mid laner. And then you got Stixxay and Huki. Talk about a bot lane that completely exploded in the spring split. I mean, I'm high on Huki. I've always been high on Huki, but even I couldn't have predicted how good these two would have been across all of spring. Stixxay did a great job being able to capitalize on advantages that he was able to get in the early game to be able to basically hyper carry a lot of games in the mid to late game for them, which is a very difficult thing to do, but Stixxay showing that he is definitely a more than capable LCS caliber bot laner. He was all pro caliber this past split. Obviously, it's a really big jump up from what he's been able to do in past splits, but, again, if he gets to play with Huki, he's probably going to be better because Huki is just that guy. He's going to rank as my number 2 support. I think he's the best player on this Golden Guardians team, and certainly the most unsung player on this Golden Guardians team. I believe in the Huki supremacy. Basically, every bot laner that he has played with has gotten better for playing with him, and so I don't see a reason for that not to continue here in summer with Stixxay. If these two can continue to be a big power point on the map for Golden Guardians, if Huki can continue to play those engagers and be really aggressive in the early to mid game and be able to take over a lot of the macro, that's going to be huge for Golden Guardians. And then Stixxay is so aggressive. If he's going to be, putting his life on the line to be able to generate a lot of gold leads in the bot lane, especially if the rest of the team is going to be willing to play through him for that, this is still a very, very scary bot lane with Gory facilitating, with River having a good year, and if you get, peak Licorice back with confidence and being consistent, this could legitimately be better than the third best team in the league. That's what they were last split. They made finals. They made MSI, and so there are a lot of positives to talk about, but again, there are some negatives. There are a couple of players that really broke out in spring, and you have to question, you have to wonder how sustainable it's going to be. I do believe in quite a few of these players. I definitely believe in Huki and Gory, but is Licorice going to have a full split of being, that upper tier top laner? We'll see. Is River going to regress like he did in summer of last year? We'll see. Is Stixxay going to be the same kind of hyper carry all pro caliber ADC that he was in spring, or is he going to revert back to what he's been the last 2 years? There are question marks on this team that I do think need answering, which is why they come into the B tier and not the A tier for me, but this is the team by far out of any team that we've covered so far that has the most upside to be one of the better teams in the entire region. They've shown what it looks like for everything to come together. It's just about being able to repeat that, being able to do it for an entire split, and being able to do it when it matters the most. If they can get the best out of all of these players, they're going to be a team that legitimately competes for a final spot, but for now, they're going to have to settle in my power rankings for third and the last guaranteed world spot. And now moving on to our top 2 teams in my power rankings entering the 2023 summer split here in the LCS. You guys know who the last 2 are. It's just about the order, and the order's not going to surprise you guys too much. Starting our A tier for me and coming in at number 2 in the power rankings, which, by the way, A tier for me, the differentiator between A tier and B tier. B tier to me, teams that theoretically could make the World Championships, definitely probably have aspirations of making the World Championships, but it's no guarantee. I could see a world in which they don't live up to expectations and kind of flame out. A tier for me are the main contenders to win LCS and teams that absolutely should be going to Worlds by the end of the year, and it would be a huge disappointment if they did. It would be a huge underperformance. And so coming in at number 2 in my power rankings and technically at the bottom of A tier, it is going to be FlyQuest coming in for me. And it really, how do you look at this roster and not see a top 2 team? I understand they weren't able to get the job done against Golden Guardians in the playoffs in spring, but they upgraded this roster and they already probably had a better roster on paper that just needed to click and gel a little bit more. They were a couple of mistakes in that semifinals away from getting second place already, and then they went out and got arguably the best support in the region to come in and fix, hopefully fix, I should say, a lot of their communication issues that they had been having over the back half of the split. But let's not waste time. Let's go ahead and get into the roster analysis. Their roster is looking like Impact in the top lane, Spica in the jungle, Vikla in the mid lane, Prince at AD carry, and Vulcan at support. I mean, this is just an incredibly cracked lineup, mechanically speaking, just from a pure talent perspective. There is no weakness. They are all some of the best players in their roles in the region, and that's going to be the case for both of the top two teams. There really is no weaknesses when it comes to these two teams, and that has absolutely been the case. Let's go ahead and start off with Impact in the top lane. Incredibly solid top laner. What he does is have the best split that he has had in a while every time he joins a new team. It's just what he does. He did it on Cloud9, he did it on Team Liquid, he did it on Evil Geniuses, and now he's doing it on FlyQuest. That first year on a new team is always some of his best work, and that has absolutely been the case. He went from being one of the worst laners in the LCS last year, you know, a really good team fighter, but a really bad laner on Evil Geniuses last year, to someone who has been really consistent throughout every phase of the game. This is the best version of Impact coming back here, and I think that's really been a positive for FlyQuest. He's honestly been someone that they actually can win through, especially in the back half of games. Even if they don't give him resources early, he's such a good team fighter that most of the time he's going to be able to make a huge impact, pun intended, on the game towards the back half, even if he's not ridiculously far ahead. And so he definitely deserves to be in that top two conversation. For top laners, he comes in at number 2 for me, and that's definitely rising from where he was at the beginning of the year. Remember, I was going into the year feeling relatively low on Impact, and that's certainly not the case anymore. And then you've got Spica in the jungle. I was high on Spica coming into the year. I was much higher on his last year with TSM than I think a lot of other people were, but even I could not have predicted him to be as explosive as he was with this team. He was just fantastic. The team did a really good job playing around him and enabling him in the early game, and I think he was really willing to pay that off. I mean, the consistency with which he was able to play against the mid and lower teams in the league was absolutely astounding, and that's what you need to have to be one of the best teams in the regular season. And I know that there are going to be some question marks about whether or not he can continuously face the best junglers in the region, you know, over and over again in a best of 5 and be able to beat them. I believe that he can get to that point. I think we saw a lot of growth from him, a really eclectic champion pool, a lot of things that he wasn't even willing to pull out in spring that I do think he has in his back pocket. And so I think he's got a lot of surprises, a lot of tricks left to show us here on FlyQuest, and he's been a massive positive. He was probably the best or the second best jungler in the league last split. He comes in at number 2 for me, just again because there's one player that I think is absolutely astounding in this league. But I mean, if you want to rank him number 1, especially after last year or last split's performance, I'm absolutely not going to deny that. Who I do have at number 1 is going to be Vikla in the mid lane. And I know a lot of people disagree with this, but I've been pretty hard on this stance for a while now, basically since the start of the year. He hasn't really moved from that spot for me. I had him at number 1 in my preseason predictions before spring, and he hasn't moved at all. I honestly think somehow Vikla has gotten completely underrated. He's the player in the LCS, to me, that gets by far the worst rap. Like, I understand that he's a little bit coin flippy and that he can have bad moments, but he makes mistakes in moments that are typically lower value than some of the other, people, someone like Jojo Pune, who does make a lot of mistakes. He doesn't necessarily make as big of mistakes as Jojo, even if there are, fumbles here or there. But I think Vikla, mechanically speaking, is by far the best mid laner in the region. I think he showed that off super consistently. His laning phase was great. He knows when he needs to get out on the map. If he can just get a little bit of a better synergy with Spica, I think that duo could be incredibly dangerous to have to deal with. But for me, he was the best mid laner in the region in spring, and I definitely don't think that you're going to get that opinion if you go on Reddit or anything like that. And so that's a hill that I'm willing to die on, is that Vikla is actually a really, really good player and the best mid laner in North America. And I think he's going to show that again here in summer. He's going to have some up and down moments, but I think he's going to have way more ups than downs, just like he did last split. And then for Prince in the bot lane, he was my MVP pick in the spring split. Crazy to see him go down to number 2 after I called him my MVP of the regular season. I think obviously playoffs kind of showed that he is, I don't want to say he has his flaws, because he doesn't really, but he relies on his team maybe a little bit more than we expected. I think there's also another AD carry we'll get to in the next ranking that is just super good, and it would be criminal not to rank him number 1, but Prince is a top 2, top 3 player in the LCS. Having him ranked at number 2 here is not a detriment to him. AD carry is just a really hard role to be number 1 in NA right now, and I think Prince is a legit world-class player, and I think he has shown that off basically everywhere that he has been since last year. He dominated for Live Sandbox, almost dragged them to the World Championships, and then was, in my opinion, the MVP of the regular season. Do you want more consistency from him? Yes, but now hopefully bringing in a support like Vulcan to be able to play with him is going to help a lot with that consistency, especially in the mid game, and that's really where I think Vulcan is going to help out a lot. He comes in as my number 1 support in the region. Great addition here. Obviously, the memes are a-flowing with Vulcan replacing Ayla here on FlyQuest, but this is about the single best upgrade FlyQuest could have done in the offseason to secure their spot in top 2 for me, and that's exactly why they rank top 2 is this addition for Vulcan for me. I just think he is so ridiculously good for what this team wants to do, which is be a little bit more aggressive and coordinated, I should say, in the mid game. I think that's probably the way that I would look at it. I think Prince and Vulcan have the potential to be easily the best bot lane in North America. I honestly think that they should go in as favorites for that role, as a duo at the very least. And, you know, whether you want to talk about early game or late game, both of them are very good at both sections of that. Obviously, Prince likes to snowball a bit more than your average AD carry, but Vulcan's very good at that as well. He's very good in team fights. He's very good at snowballing. He's just an all-around really good player, and really what you're bringing him in for is hopefully to fix a lot of the communication issues that you had towards the back half of the split. I really do see this team as a team that could potentially, I don't want to say break the mold here in the LCS, but they could be the best team in the league, like by far. They were for a lot of spring split, a lot of the regular season. They were the best team in the LCS. They faltered down the stretch. They couldn't find their form again, and then they couldn't get it done in the playoffs against Golden Guardians. But all of that, you have to hope, is just processed to set up for what is a better summer split. This team has the potential to be number 1 by a clear margin, especially if you get Prince and Vulcan on the same page. If Vikla continues to be the best mid laner, if Spica and Impact can continue to be solid, like, there is no ceiling for this team at the LCS level, and I think it was unfortunately very criminal that we didn't get to see them on an international stage. Hopefully that's something that they get to remedy with their placement in the summer split. Hopefully we get to see them at Worlds. And that's going to bring us to my number 1 team in my LCS Summer Split Power Rankings video. And again, this is not going to be a surprise to a lot of people. This is the consensus best team in the LCS right now. Coming in at number 1 in my Power Rankings, and at the top of A tier for me, it is going to be Cloud9. How could it be anybody else? They have proven at this point that they are the best team in the LCS until proven otherwise. Not only were they able to pretty much dominate the playoffs, get through it relatively easily, and get to MSI as the number 1 seed, but they were able to take down Golden Guardians at MSI as well. And so I don't really have a lot of question marks about Cloud9 in terms of them going into the season being the best team in the LCS. Now, whether or not they're able to maintain some of the momentum that they have, you know, that's going to be up for debate, but, you know, spoiler alert, I think they're probably going to be able to do that, and they should be your favorites to win the summer split. So let's go ahead and talk about their roster. Their lineup is looking like Fudge in the top lane, Blabber in the jungle, Eminus in the mid lane, Berserker at AD carry, and Sven at support, starting, of course, with Fudge in the top lane. Some people are going to be critical of me putting him as the number 1 top laner in North America, but he was over the course of last split. And to me, it wasn't particularly close. I think he got snubbed in terms of MVP voting. To me, he was number 2, only behind Prince. In terms of my MVP voting, I think he had a much bigger impact on this team than anybody gave him credit for, especially early on in the split. I think recency bias definitely contributed to him not getting nearly as many MVP votes as he maybe deserved, but he was sensational, easily the best top laner in the region, was one of the few top laners that a team genuinely decided to invest a ridiculous amount into, and he paid it back for them, absolutely, like a lot. And I think Fudge honestly gets underrated by the community quite a bit. I know his international performances haven't exactly been perfect over the last few years, but he has been so good domestically that it's almost impossible for me to rank him as anything other than the number 1 top laner in the region up until this point. Now, obviously, there's a lot of candidates to be able to replace him, players like Impact and Someday, and, you know, a player like Summit or Dokla, or, you know, there are a lot of players that can kind of break through that glass ceiling and kind of get to that point where Fudge is at now, but I would be remiss to put him anything other than number 1 in terms of my top lane rankings, and the same goes for jungle. This one's not going to upset nearly as many people. Blabber's the best jungler in the league. He's the best jungler that the league has ever seen. He's the best endemic, you know, North American player. Maybe Doublelift has the resume to beat him out, but Blabber is right up there with him. Like, it is absolutely absurd what Blabber has been able to accomplish for this organization. He's the best player in Cloud9 history. I'm willing to die on that hill, and he continues to be the best jungler in the league, and it's not particularly close, especially when the games matter more. That's when Blabber steps up. He will be an MVP candidate every single year until the sun stops shining. Like, there really is nothing that's going to stop him. He's just so good at every facet of the game. He's so aggressive in the early game, and oftentimes, especially at this level, he's able to get away with a lot of very risky plays, but even then, again, like, his team is so willing to back him up that he knows he can, push forward and get into situations that maybe other teams aren't going to be able to get into because of his individual talent and also his team's ability to play around him. And then his mid to late game is about as consistent as you could possibly ask for at this level. The dude is superhuman. There are times legitimately where he looks like a top, 6 or 7 jungler in the world. Like, there will be, 3 or 4 game stretches where that's kind of the perception that you have of Blabber. Now, he's not going to play like that always. He is a little bit streakier than maybe your average superstar, but even his bad games are usually not too bad. It's just there are going to be times where he isn't a complete and utter game menace. But if you get a stretch of like 6 or 7 games from Blabber that is, the best of anybody in the region and it's not close, like, no one's going to be surprised. That's the kind of player that he is. He's just the GOAT, right? Like, there really is nothing else to say. He's fantastic, and I feel like it is almost impossible to underrate him at this point in terms of his success level. And then you've got Immortals starting in the mid lane. He gets the full split now, came in midway through spring and was definitely an upgrade for this team, and obviously, I think what he offers is a little bit more explosive than what Diplex offered at the beginning of last split. He's someone who can carry a bit more, but I do think there are question marks when it comes to him, which is why he only comes in at number 3 and not higher than either Vikla or Gory in terms of the mid lane rankings. Like, skill-wise, he's probably number 1. He's probably the most talented mid laner in the region. Maybe Vikla, right? But he's more talented as a carry, in my opinion, than Gory is. But what he isn't is consistent. And again, if you'll notice, that's a big thing with me is, yes, I like the upside of Eminence, but it's hard for me to rank him above players that I just trust game to game a little bit more than him. There were some games where he looked great, and obviously his addition to the team I think was definitely a positive overall, but there were also some games where he just wasn't good, where he lost lane and didn't really have a way to recover, and I think that's what you're going to get a little bit more out of him than you are out of some of the other players on this roster. Like, Fudge very rarely loses lane at the LCS level, Blabber very rarely loses early game at the LCS level, Berserker very rarely loses anything at the LCS level. Eminence is probably the lane that's the most exploitable in terms of the consistency from game to game, but even then, the mechanical upside that Eminence offers this team is still ridiculous and immense, and we saw it in the playoffs. We saw when he was allowed to get going, when he played an isolated 1v1, how dominant he could be. He was just better than Gory in that series in the finals, and it was by a lot, and so Eminence's upside is number 1 in the region, but for consistency's sake, he's only going to come in at number 3 in terms of my rankings, and then bot lane of Berserker and Sven. Berserker comes in as the number 180 carry. I really love Prince. I love him. I think he's a great player. I think he's honestly disrespected a bit by the community. I think that he clearly deserves a lot of praise and success, even if, FlyQuest kind of fell off a bit towards the back half of the split. But it is undeniable that Berserker deserves the number 1 spot in terms of AD carries. He is just a ridiculous player. He is an absolute beast at this level, a world-class AD carry, somebody who I think you could plug into an LCK team, and he could function at a very high level, and that's certainly not something that I think Cloud9 takes for granted. They know what they have. They know he's going to win most laning phases. They know that he can take over the game both mid and late. Like, there really is no weaknesses to Berserker's game, especially at this level, and I think you should and could make the case that he is the best player in the LCS right now, and that's the case that I'm going to make. I think he's the best player in the LCS right now. I think Blabber is close. I think Prince is right up there. Those are your top 3 for me, but Berserker definitely deserves to at least be in the conversation. He's going to easily get that number 1 spot. Even though he wasn't my MVP and somebody else was, he proved it throughout the end of the regular season and then definitely in the playoffs that he is just the best AD carry in the region and will be considered as such until he proves otherwise. And then Sven in the support position, I always see the, people complaining about the number being too low, and for me, I'm just going to put Vulcan, Huki, and Core above him because their upside, I think, is just ridiculous. They are complete game changers when they are on. And I don't know if Sven is like a game changer, but he's like the top of the will do everything in his power to make everybody else on the team look great kind of standings. I think he makes Berserker look better. Those two have great synergy in the bot lane, especially early on in laning phases. He can be a little bit over-aggressive in terms of getting vision sometimes, but some of the best supports are going to be, kind of doing that every once in a while. People have criticized his champion pool, but I don't think it's a problem. Again, I always talk about how if you can't get banned out, or if other teams aren't willing to ban you out, then your champion pool being small isn't necessarily an issue, and I certainly don't think that's the case for Sven, just as it isn't the case for, like, Core JJ, who's great, or Huhi, who are great at engagers, etc., right? Everybody in the LCS kind of has a style, and I think Sven definitely has his, but it makes the rest of his team better, so kind of ignore the number here. He's going to come in just below, like, those game-breaking, game-changing supports, or at least the supports that I have, the potential to be that, but more than solid as somebody who can be on the best team in the league, can go to an international event and not be a problem for your team. You have a team right here that is set up to be by far the most talented in the entire league. They've already shown they have a good amount of chemistry together. Berserker doesn't need resources. Fudge doesn't need resources to win. Blabber doesn't need resources to win. Like, they're an incredibly scary prospect. If they can just keep up even half or even a part of what they were able to do in the spring split, like, this team is going to be legitimately unstoppable. That's the kind of upside that they have. Now, obviously, nothing is guaranteed in the LCS or in LoL esports in general, and so we could see some of these players start to regress, but I would heavily bet against it. I think the talent level on this team is there. I think the consistency on this team is there, and for me, they were a very, very clear choice to be the #1 team in my power rankings going into the year. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS 2023 Summer Split Primer and Power Rankings. I really do hope you guys enjoyed the video. These are some of my favorite videos to make. They're the longest ones that I make, for the most part, all year long, and so I hope you guys really do enjoy the in-depth coverage of all 10 teams here in the LCS. If you did, leave a like on this video. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which obviously I'm very appreciative of. Of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. We're going to be covering every single week of the LCS in weekly recaps whenever it does end up starting on this channel. And then not only do we cover the LCS, we cover all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL on this channel. So if you're, looking at the LCS and you're mad at, Riot for pulling out on Tier 2, well, I'm going to be covering the new Tier 2 all split long. So hit that subscribe button if you want weekly updates on all 4 of the major regions as well as those. And of course, let me know down in the comments who I'm too high on and who I'm too low on. Of course, I'd love to have a civil conversation with you guys. If you have a disagreement, let me know what you disagree on. Don't just say X player is too high or X player is too low. Who should they be above? Who should they be below? I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback. We're not all going to think the same, and that's the fun of making these videos is, we kind of get different opinions down there, and so I really do hope you guys enjoyed. With all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.